The gods of Mount Olympus ruled the ancient world for over 1,000 years. From their palace above the clouds, they controlled the seas and the skies, the harvests and the seasons, presiding over love and death itself. They were worshipped across the Mediterranean, feared by mortals and immortals alike, and their rivalries, love affairs, and vendettas shaped every aspect of Greek mythology. But why did Poseidon and Athena wage a bitter rivalry that lasted for generations? Why did Zeus transform himself into a magnificent white bull and chase a woman across the seas? What drove Hera, queen of the gods, to persecute the children of her own husband? And how did Hephaestus, the smithing god discarded at birth for being malformed, win the hand of the most beautiful goddess in existence? Welcome to this special presentation of Soft History Stories. Today, we explore the legendary tales of Mount Olympus, from the birth of the cosmos to the tragic fall of mortal heroes. This is the complete story of the Greek gods. As king of the gods, Zeus ruled over Mount Olympus, where the gods dwelt in palaces of white marble and gold. Great bronze gates guarded the entrance, and within, each deity maintained a residence worthy of their power. The mountain itself rose so high that clouds perpetually wreathed its peak, hiding the gods from human eyes. But Zeus could see through those clouds. No mortal action escaped his notice. No prayer went unheard. When storms gathered in the sky, mortals knew Zeus was angry. When thunder rolled across the heavens, they heard his voice. When lightning split the darkness, they saw his judgment made manifest. The thunderbolt was his weapon, forged by the Cyclopes in gratitude for their freedom. And when Zeus hurled it in anger, towers crumbled and forests burned. Yet it was not just storms, but all weather that came under his command. Clear skies and gentle rains came when he was pleased, while storms and blizzards descended when his anger burned cold. The Greeks built temples to Zeus in every city, but none more magnificent than the sanctuary at Olympia. There, every 4 years, a sacred truce was declared across all of Greece, and athletes gathered from every corner of the Greek world to compete in games held in Zeus's honor. These Olympic Games were as much a religious festival as an athletic competition. On the third day, no competitions were held at all. Instead, a great procession marched to the massive altar of Zeus, a structure built up over centuries from the ash and bones of previous sacrifices, and there they performed the hecatomb, sacrificing 100 oxen to the king of the gods. The thigh bones wrapped in fat were burned on the altar, the smoke rising to Olympus as Zeus's portion, while the meat was cooked and distributed among thousands of spectators in a communal feast. Inside the great temple itself sat the statue of Zeus, crafted by the sculptor Phidias, and considered one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. The god sat upon a throne 40 feet high, his skin of ivory, his robes of gold, so massive that if he had stood, he would have burst through the temple roof. Athletes competed under his watchful gaze, and every spectator who entered the sanctuary could look upon the physical embodiment of the god they honored. But Zeus was not merely a distant force to be feared and appeased. He was the enforcer of xenia, or guest friendship, the sacred laws of hospitality that governed the treatment of guests and strangers, and kept travelers safe across an often dangerous world. As such, Zeus was known to walk among mortals more than most gods, though always in disguise. He tested them, appearing at their doors as a beggar or traveler, judging whether they would offer hospitality to a stranger. Those who welcomed the unknown guest with food and shelter discovered they had entertained Zeus himself and would be rewarded for their kindness. Those, however, who turned strangers away found their homes struck by lightning or their crops withered by drought. Yet, even though Zeus now possessed absolute power over Olympus and the mortal world alike, there was still one thing he lacked. He needed a queen to rule beside him. But finding the right one would prove more complicated than the king of the gods had ever expected. Choosing a wife proved to be complicated for the king of the gods. His appetites were vast, his affections changeable, and his eyes wandered constantly. Before he finally settled on a permanent queen, Zeus would marry no fewer than 7 times, and each marriage would produce children who would shape the world in profound ways. His first wife was Metis, the titaness of wisdom and cunning thought, who had once helped him overthrow Cronus. Zeus, impressed by her intelligence, took her as his bride, and it was not long until Metis became pregnant. But Zeus made the mistake of consulting his grandparents, Gaia and Uranus, about the child. They delivered a prophecy that chilled him. Metis was destined to bear a son who would overthrow Zeus and take his throne. Just as Zeus had overthrown Cronus, and just as Cronus had overthrown Uranus, the cycle of violence would continue. Zeus refused to allow this fate. He challenged Metis to a shape-shifting contest, each of them transforming into different forms to demonstrate their power, and Metis transformed herself into a fly. Zeus opened his mouth and swallowed her whole. He thought the problem solved. Months passed, and Zeus almost forgot the incident entirely, busy pursuing his next wife. But then the headaches began. The pain grew worse every day, pounding inside his skull with such intensity that soon he could barely think at all. Finally, he summoned Hephaestus in desperation, commanding the smith god to split his head open with an axe. Hephaestus reluctantly obeyed, bringing his axe down on Zeus's skull with a strike he was sure would be fatal. The blade split the skin and bone, and from the wound leapt a fully grown goddess, already armored and carrying a spear and shield, possessing a wisdom that rivaled her mother's. This was Athena, daughter of Zeus and Metis, born directly from her father's forehead. Zeus's headache vanished instantly. He had a daughter, not a son, and the prophecy seemed diverted. But Metis remained inside him, her wisdom now part of his own thoughts, whispering counsel he could not ignore. In a sense, she ruled with him still, her cleverness merged with his power. Before his second wife, Zeus chose his aunt, Themis, the titaness who embodied divine law and natural order. Their marriage was more a political alliance than a love match, but it produced children of extraordinary importance. Themis bore Zeus the Horai, goddesses of the seasons, who ensured the orderly progression of spring to summer, to autumn to winter. But more significantly, she bore him 3 daughters who had come to hold power over every living being. These were the Moirai, the Fates, and even Zeus would learn that he could not overrule their decrees. Clotho, the spinner, was the youngest. She sat at her spinning wheel, and when she spun, a new soul came into being. The middle sister was Lachesis, the allotter. She carried a rod with which she measured each thread that Clotho spun, determining not only the length of that life, but the triumphs and tragedies that would mark it. And finally, the eldest was Atropos, called the Unturning, for her decisions could never be reversed. When a mortal's allotted time had ended, she cut their thread. Death followed instantly, and nothing, not even the gods, could prevent it. The fates operated beyond prayer and sacrifice. Mortals could not bribe them or bargain with them, and not even Zeus could control them. In this way, Themis's gift to the cosmos was order itself, the certainty that all things, even gods, operated within boundaries that could not be transgressed. Zeus's subsequent marriages were briefer, but no less consequential. The Oceanid Eurynome bore him the 3 graces who embodied beauty, joy, and festivity, and whose presence could lift even the darkest mood on Olympus. His own sister, Demeter, bore him a single daughter, Persephone, whose story would become one of the most consequential in all of mythology. And Mnemosyne, titaness of memory, bore him 9 daughters in a single birth, the Muses, goddesses who would inspire every form of human creativity, from epic poetry to music, from tragedy to astronomy. Wherever humans created something beautiful or lasting, the Muses were present, breathing inspiration into mortal minds. Zeus's 6th wife was the titaness Leto, who would bear him the twins, Apollo and Artemis. But their story began not with joy, but with jealousy and persecution. For by the time Zeus married Leto, his 7th and final wife was already watching his every move, growing tired of his wandering eyes. That 7th wife, the one who would finally become the permanent queen of Olympus, was Zeus's own sister, Hera. Hera was the goddess of women and marriage, protector of wives and families. She was beautiful, powerful, and proud, but she had no desire to marry her brother. Their mother, Rhea, had made clear her disapproval of such a union, and Hera respected her mother's wishes. More than that, Hera valued her independence, having no interest in becoming subordinate to Zeus, or enduring his constant infidelities. Perhaps it was her very indifference that drew him, the fact that she did not fawn over him as others did, that caused Zeus to desire her above all others. He pursued her relentlessly, his advances being rejected day after day, until finally Zeus resorted to deception. He knew Hera walked often in the foothills below Olympus, enjoying the mortal world's beauty. He waited until she was alone, far from witnesses, and transformed himself into a small bird, bedraggled and shivering as if caught in a storm. The bird fell from the sky and landed in Hera's lap. She looked down at the pitiful creature, its tiny body trembling, and felt her heart soften. She gathered the bird gently in her hands and wrapped it in her cloak to keep it warm. The moment the cloak enclosed them both, Zeus transformed back to his true form. Hera found herself suddenly in her brother's embrace, his arms around her, his face close to hers. She had been tricked, and now she faced a choice: cry out and bring shame upon herself when others discovered them in this compromising position, or accept what had happened and make the best of it. Hera, always conscious of propriety and reputation, chose the latter. If she was going to be bound to Zeus, she would do so as his wife, not as another of his casual conquests. They married shortly after, and Hera took her place on the throne beside him as Queen of Olympus. It was not a love match, despite Zeus's initial passion. It was a partnership forged from necessity and pride. Hera would rule at Zeus's side, managing Olympus and protecting women and families, but she would never forget how their marriage began. She would never fully trust her husband. The jealousy that would define her character and drive so many myths forward had its roots in that moment of deception, in the knowledge that Zeus had wanted her badly enough to trick her into marriage, but not enough to remain faithful once he had won. Even with Hera finally seated beside him as queen, Zeus's lustful eye continued to wander. He would father countless children across the world, with goddesses and nymphs and mortal women alike, and his descendants would include nearly every hero and half-divine being that would ever walk the earth. To hide his infidelities from Hera, whose jealousy grew more terrible with each betrayal, Zeus became a master of disguise. He transformed himself into animals, into mortals, into showers of gold and beams of light. Whatever form would gain him success to the woman who caught his eye, he would assume it without hesitation. One such woman was Europa, a Phoenician princess from the city of Tyre. She was known for her beauty and grace, and when Zeus saw her walking along the seashore one spring morning, picking flowers with her attendants, he decided he must have her. Hera, however, had eyes and ears everywhere, with Zeus deciding to take a form that would allow him to get close without raising suspicion. He chose to become a bull, but not any ordinary bull. He transformed himself into the most magnificent specimen Europa had ever seen. The bull was pure white, its coat shining like snow in the sunlight. Its horns were perfectly curved, and its eyes were gentle and intelligent, being able to mesmerize with the smallest glance. It approached the beach where Europa and her companions played, moving gracefully despite its size. Europa noticed the bull immediately, and while her companions hung back nervously, she approached it without fear, drawn in by its beauty. When she reached out and touched its side, the bull stood perfectly still, gentle and calm. Emboldened, Europa laughed and climbed onto its back, calling to her friends to watch. The moment she settled onto the bull's broad back, Zeus launched himself forward at tremendous speed, running straight toward the sea. Europa clutched desperately the bull's horns, too shocked to jump off, and before she knew what was happening, they were in the water, the bull carrying her away from everything she had ever known. The coastline of Phoenicia quickly vanished behind them, until water stretched endlessly in dual directions. Europa could do nothing but cling to the bull's horns, terrified and weeping, certain she was going to drown or be devoured. Finally, when they were far from any land that Europa recognized, Zeus spoke. "Do not be afraid," he said. "I am no mere beast. I am Zeus, king of the gods, and I have chosen you above all mortal women. I am taking you to Crete, the island where I was hidden as a child, where you will be safe and honored. You will bear me sons who will become kings and founders of great nations. Europa's terror did not entirely subside, but it mixed now with awe and confusion. She had been taken by force, certainly, but he was the king of Olympus, and mortals did not refuse the gods. She stopped struggling and simply held on as the bull swam onward. They reached Crete as the sun was setting, the sky painted gold and red. Zeus carried Europa to a quiet grove, transformed back to his true form, and there they stayed. Europa would indeed bear him sons, and they would become some of the most renowned figures in Greek legend. Minos would become king of Crete, famous for his wisdom, ruling over a palace that would one day house the Minotaur. Rhadamanthus would be appointed one of the judges of the dead, and Sarpedon would found cities and establish kingdoms of his own. To commemorate what he insisted on thinking of as love, though Europa might have called it something else, Zeus named the continent on which they now stood, Europe, in her honor, carrying her name across the ages. He then placed the image of the white bull in the stars, creating the constellation Taurus, so that every generation would remember the day that the king of the gods crossed the sea, disguised as a beast. Hera, wife of Zeus and queen of the gods, was the protector of marriage and women. Mortal wives prayed to her for harmony in their households, for healthy children and faithful husbands. She presided over weddings and blessed unions that honored the sacred bonds she represented. In Greek society, she was deeply respected with her temples numerous and worship widespread. But Hera was also one of the most vengeful gods on Mount Olympus, and this made her a catastrophically poor match for her husband. Zeus's numerous affairs drew her anger like lightning to a mountaintop, and that anger, once kindled, burned with a fury that could destroy cities. She could not strike directly at Zeus, for he was too powerful, and open rebellion against the king of the gods was unthinkable. So instead, Hera directed her rage at his lovers and their children, pursuing them with a determination that made even the other gods uncomfortable. One of Zeus's most insulting acts of infidelity, at least from Hera's perspective, involved Io, a princess of Argos, who served as one of Hera's own priestesses. The girl was loyal, devoted to her service, and entirely innocent. None of this mattered to Zeus when desire struck him, with him beginning a series of nighttime visits to Hera's temple, foolishly believing she would not notice. He was wrong. The queen of the gods descended from Olympus to investigate, and Zeus, seeing her approach, began to panic. He transformed Io into a beautiful white cow, hoping this crude disguise would fool his wife. But when she arrived, she found him standing there beside the cow, chewing on a reed and attempting to look casual, as if he often spent time in meadows admiring cattle. Hera was not fooled for a moment, but she was clever enough not to confront Zeus directly without proof. Instead, she smiled and complimented him on the magnificent white cow. "Dear husband," she said sweetly, "what a beautiful cow you have there." "Oh, this cow." Zeus patted the beast nervously. "This cow is nothing special at all. It is definitely no cow of mine." "Is that so?" Hera's smile widened. "Then you would have no problem if I took it, would you?" Zeus felt his stomach drop. He was trapped, for to refuse would only confirm Hera's suspicions. He had no choice but to present his wife with Io, still trapped in bovine form, and watch as Hera led her away. Hera knew her husband would attempt to rescue his lover, but had no intention of making it easy for either of them. She placed Io under the guard of Argus Panoptes, a giant with 100 eyes scattered across his body. The perfect guardian, Argus never fully slept, for even when resting, half his eyes remained open. He tied Io to an olive tree by day and locked her in a stable by night, never allowing her a moment's freedom, constantly watching to ensure Zeus could not approach. Zeus watched from Olympus, overwhelmed by guilt and helplessness. To intervene directly would be to invite Hera's wrath, but he could not simply abandon Io to eternal imprisonment. Finally he summoned Hermes, the messenger god, and commanded him to free the unfortunate princess. Hermes was clever, and he understood that Argus could not be defeated through force, his 100 eyes allowing him to see and react to any strike before it landed. So instead, Hermes disguised himself as a simple shepherd and approached Argus as a friend, sitting down beside him to share stories and pass the time. He carried his pipes, and as the day wore on, he began to play. The music was soft and sweet, gentle as a lullaby, and gradually, Argus began to relax. One by one, his eyes began to close. First a dozen, then 2 dozen, then 50, then 90. Hermes continued playing, his music never wavering, watching carefully as the last few eyes drooped shut. When the 100th eye finally closed, Hermes acted instantly. He drew his sword and struck off Argus's head in a single blow. The giant died without waking, and Io was free. Hera discovered the murder almost immediately. She mourned Argus's loyalty, and to honor his service, she took his 100 eyes and set them in the tail of a peacock, her favorite bird. To this day, peacocks display those distinctive eye spots on their magnificent tails, each one a remnant of Hera's loyal servant. But Io's freedom did not end her torment. Hera, enraged by Hermes's interference, sent a gadfly to pursue the girl. The insect was small but relentless. It followed Io everywhere, stinging her constantly, driving her to run endlessly, never stopping, never finding rest. Still trapped in bovine form, Io fled across the known world, her desperate flight giving names to the places she passed. She ran along the coast of a sea that would later be named the Ionian Sea in her memory. She crossed a strait between Europe and Asia that would forever after be called the Bosphorus, meaning Ford of the Cow. She wandered for years, suffering constantly, until finally she reached Egypt, so far from Greece that even Hera's power could not easily reach her. Zeus descended at last, and restored Io to her human form. He could not undo the years of suffering, but he could at least end the punishment. Io bore Zeus a son, Epaphus, who would become king of Egypt. Through him, she became the ancestor of many of Greece's greatest heroes, including Perseus and Heracles. The priestess, who had been transformed into a cow, became the founding mother of heroism itself. Though the price she paid for that honor was terrible beyond measure, Leto, Zeus's 6th wife, had been a titaness, and she had given Zeus twin children who had become 2 of the most powerful Olympians. But being the mother of gods did not protect her from Hera's jealous rage. When the queen of the gods discovered that Leto had spent a night with Zeus and now carried his children in her womb, her fury was absolute. She sent the great serpent Python, a monstrous creature that had terrorized the earth since ancient times, to hunt Leto down and prevent her from giving birth. The serpent pursued her relentlessly, driving her from place to place, and never allowing even a moment of rest. Leto fled across the entirety of Greece in her desperation, her pregnancy growing more difficult with each passing day, searching frantically for somewhere safe to deliver her children. But Hera's reach was long. She decreed that no land could offer Leto shelter, no city could take her in. Any place that dared to provide refuge for Zeus's pregnant lover would face the queen of the gods' wrath, a risk none were willing to take. Leto traveled from Athens to Crete, from Lemnos to Samos, begging for sanctuary, but every door closed before her. Finally, on the brink of despair, she came to Delos, a barren, rocky island adrift in the Aegean Sea. Delos was so poor and insignificant that it barely registered in Hera's attention, but even this tiny island hesitated to defy the queen of the gods. But Leto had nowhere else to go, and so she made the island's people a promise. If Delos would shelter her and allow her to give birth, her son Apollo would honor the island forever. He would make Delos his sacred place, build temples there, and bring pilgrims from across the Greek world. The barren rock would become a center of worship known throughout Greece. Delos, with little to lose and everything to gain, agreed. Leto finally had her sanctuary, but Hera was not finished with her persecution. Even as Leto's labor began, Hera enacted her cruelest plot yet. She trapped Aletheia, the goddess of childbirth, and her own daughter, on Mount Olympus, preventing any births from taking place throughout the world. And so Leto's labor continued, agonizing and endless. But still the children would not come. For 9 days and 9 nights, Leto suffered unendurable pain. The pain was unrelenting, her body racked with contractions that led nowhere, the twins trapped within her, unable to enter the world. She cried out for help, but there was no help to give. Hera had ensured that this torture would continue until Leto died or went mad, whichever came first. Finally, The other goddesses could no longer bear to witness such suffering. They gathered together and offered Hera a bribe, a necklace of gold and amber, beautiful enough to tempt even the queen of the gods. In exchange, they begged her to release Aletheia. Hera, satisfied that she had made her point, finally relented. Aletheia descended from Olympus and arrived on Delos. The moment she stepped onto the island, Leto's labor resumed properly. First came Artemis, a daughter, emerging into the world as dawn broke over the Aegean. Then, with the newborn child's help, for even as an infant, Artemis possessed the power to assist in childbirth. Apollo was born as the sun reached its zenith. The twins had arrived, and they would grow to become two of the most powerful and complex gods on board Olympus. Apollo would embody light, music, prophecy, and healing. Artemis would rule over the hunt, the moon, wild places, and virginity. Both would be deadly archers, and both would remember forever how their mother had suffered because of Hera's jealousy. The birth of the divine twins was cause for celebration across the Greek world. Cities held festivals in their honor, with sacrifices made at newly constructed altars. The city of Thebes hosted the grandest celebrations of all, its streets filled with music and dancing for days on end. However, the city's queen, a woman by the name of Niobe, refused to participate. Her beauty was matched only by her arrogance, and when her subjects approached her, urging their queen to make offerings to Leto, she laughed at them. "Why should I honor Leto?" she called back. "She has only 2 children. I have 14, 7 sons and 7 daughters, each one more beautiful than the last. If anyone deserves worship, it is I, not some titaness who birthed just 2 children." The crowd fell silent, horrified by her words. To compare oneself to the gods was the height of hubris, and to claim superiority over them was to practically invite retribution. Sure enough, word quickly reached Leto on Delos. The goddess who had suffered so terribly to bring her children into the world was in no mood for mercy. She summoned her children, already grown to their full divine power, and sent them to Thebes. The twins descended upon the city like a storm. Apollo found Niobe's 7 sons practicing athletics in the gymnasium. He drew his golden bow and loosed arrow after arrow, striking down each and every one of them. Niobe heard the commotion and ran from the palace. She found her sons dead or dying, her earlier arrogance shattering into grief and horror. But her daughters were still alive, 7 girls huddled together in the palace. "Please," she begged, looking up at the sky, where the twins loomed ominously. "Please, I spoke with foolish pride. I see my error. I will honor Leto above all others. I will make offerings at her altar every day for the rest of my life. Only spare my daughters. Let me have something left." But the lesson had not been fully taught. Artemis raised her silver bow and sent her own arrows flying. The 7 daughters fell one after another, struck down in the palace halls, until all 14 of Niobe's children lay dead. Niobe knelt among the bodies of her children, her pride utterly destroyed, her arrogance burned away, leaving only despair. She could not speak, she could not move. She simply knelt there, tears streaming down her face. For days she remained frozen in grief, neither eating nor drinking, unable to accept what had happened. Finally she left Thebes, her mind broken, wandering without direction until she found herself back in her homeland of Sipylus in western Anatolia. There, still weeping, still unable to process the enormity of her loss, she collapsed on a mountainside. Zeus took pity on her and granted her the only mercy she could still receive, an end to consciousness. He transformed her into stone where she lay, her body becoming part of the mountain itself. There, Niobe remains to this day, a rocky outcrop on a mountainside, her face still visible in the stone's contours. The locals call it the Weeping Rock, for when rain falls and seeps through the porous rock, Niobe can still be seen crying to this day, grieving eternally for her lost children. Apollo, the younger of the twins by moments, became one of the most complex figures among the Olympians. He was the god of light, though not the sun itself. That role still belonged to Helios. But Apollo embodied illumination in a broader sense, clarity, reason, and truth, the light that dispels confusion and ignorance. He was the god of music, carrying his golden lyre and leading the muses in their songs. Under Apollo's patronage, poetry and song flourished among mortals, and the greatest bards of Greece would invoke his name before performing. Most importantly, Apollo was the god of prophecy. The ability to see the future, to know what had not yet occurred, belonged to him more than to any other deity. And it was in pursuit of establishing his oracle that Apollo committed his first great act of vengeance. Python, the great serpent that had pursued his mother at Hera's command, had made its home on Mount Parnassus in central Greece, the same mountain where Deucalion and Pyrrha had survived the great flood. The creature was ancient and enormous, its coils spanning entire hillsides, its presence poisoning the land around it. When Apollo came of age, he took his golden bow, descended from Olympus, and hunted the serpent across the mountain slopes. The battle was fierce. Python was old and powerful, a creature from the era before the Olympians rose to power. But Apollo was patient, loosing countless arrows, each one finding its mark, until finally the great serpent collapsed, its massive body stretching across the mountainside. Where Python died, Apollo built a temple. Yet the location was significant beyond mere symbolism. Deep beneath the temple, geological faults released vapors from the earth, ethylene gas, though the Greeks did not know to call it that, which rose through cracks in the rock. Apollo established his oracle there, appointing a priestess called the Pythia, named in honor of the serpent he had slain. The Pythia would sit upon a tripod, placed over the chasm from which the vapors rose. She would inhale the fumes, and they would send her into a trance state, her mind altered, her consciousness opened to receive Apollo's prophecies. In this frenzied condition, she would speak, often in garbled, cryptic phrases that priests would then interpret and deliver to the supplicants who had come seeking divine knowledge. The Oracle of Delphi became one of the most influential institutions in the Greek world. Kings consulted it before declaring war. Colonists sought its blessing before founding new cities. Even common farmers came with their questions about crops and marriages and the futures of their children. Know thyself and nothing in excess were inscribed on the temple walls, guiding principles for all who sought Apollo's wisdom. The oracle's pronouncements were famously ambiguous. When Croesus, the wealthy king of Lydia, asked if he should attack Persia, the oracle replied that if he crossed a certain river, he would destroy a great empire. Encouraged, Croesus attacked, only to destroy his own empire, for the Persians crushed his forces and conquered his kingdom. The oracle had spoken truth, but not the truth Croesus expected. Apollo's knowledge of the future was absolute, but he chose to reveal it in ways that tested mortal wisdom and judgment. Fresh from his victory over Python, Apollo was filled with pride. He had slain an ancient monster, established his oracle, and claimed his place among the greatest of the Olympians. His skill with the bow was unmatched, or so he believed. When he encountered Eros, the youthful god of love, carrying his own small bow and quiver of arrows, Apollo could not resist mocking him. "What business does a child have with a warrior's weapons?" he laughed. "Your arrows are toys compared to mine. I have slain Python with countless shots. What great deed have you accomplished with your little bow?" Eros was furious, although he did not respond with words. If Apollo wanted to learn the power of his arrows, then he would receive a demonstration he would never forget. The young god followed Apollo to the river Peneus in Thessaly, where Daphne often walked. She was beautiful, but she had dedicated herself to Artemis, choosing virginity and the hunt over marriage and domestic life. Eros drew 2 arrows from his quiver. The first had a golden tip, and when he fired it at Apollo, love infected the god like a fever. Suddenly, Apollo's mockery evaporated, replaced by overwhelming desire, focused entirely on the nymph walking along the riverbank. The second arrow had a tip of lead, and when Eros fired it at Daphne, it filled her with revulsion, specifically toward Apollo, ensuring that the sight of him would inspire nothing but disgust and fear. When Apollo approached her, his usual confidence had been stripped away, replaced by a desperation that was plain to see. "Please," he called out. "Wait, I mean you no harm. I'm Apollo, a god of Olympus. Please, let me speak with you. Let me show you the depth of my love." Daphne saw a god approaching with desire in his eyes, and terror seized her. She ran. Apollo, consumed by Eros's spell, and convinced that if he could only speak with her properly, she would understand his love, gave chase. Running with the speed of a god, Apollo quickly gained on the frightened nymph, drawing closer with every step. "Father," she cried out, calling to Peneus, "please help me, save me from this." The river god heard his daughter's plea. He could not strike Apollo directly. One god could not harm another without severe consequences, but he could transform his daughter to remove her from Apollo's reach entirely. Daphne felt a great heaviness spreading through her limbs as she ran. Her legs became sluggish and difficult to move. She slowed to a halt, and Apollo nearly reached her, his hand outstretched. But before he could touch her, her skin hardened into bark. Her arms stretched upward and sprouted leaves. Her hair became foliage, rustling in the breeze, while her feet drove down into the earth as roots. Apollo stopped, his hand hovering near what had been Daphne's shoulder, but was now a branch. Where a beautiful nymph had stood moments before, there was now a laurel tree, the first of its kind. The god stood before the tree, grief and shame washing over him. He had caused this. His pursuit had driven her to such desperation that she had chosen transformation over his attention. Yet Eros's arrow still burned in his heart, making him love what he had destroyed, a fate that would humble even the mighty god of prophecy. Apollo used his divine power to grant the laurel tree one gift: eternal youth. Its leaves would remain green year-round, never withering or dying. And he decreed that laurel wreaths would crown victors at his sacred games, that his temples would be decorated with laurel branches, and that the tree would be honored above all others. He would carry a laurel wreath wherever he went, keeping Daphne close to his heart, a reminder of love pursued so recklessly that it destroyed what it sought to claim. But Apollo's romantic tragedies did not end with Daphne. Some years later, the god encountered Hyacinthus, a Spartan prince renowned throughout Greece for his extraordinary beauty. Yet Apollo was not the only divine being captivated by the young prince. Zephyrus, the god of the west wind, had also been courting Hyacinthus for some time. But when Apollo arrived with all his golden radiance and divine charm, Hyacinthus was captivated. The prince chose the god of light over the god of wind, and Zephyrus was forced to watch as the object of his affection turned his attention elsewhere. Apollo fell deeply in love, and this time his affection was returned. They spent long days together, hunting in the mountains, practicing athletics, and making music. For once, Apollo's love brought joy rather than fear, with the god the happiest he had been in all his immortal life. But Zephyrus watched them with growing bitterness. He had loved Hyacinthus first. He had been patient and respectful. Everything Apollo had failed to be with Daphne, and still he had lost to the golden god, who seemed to win everything without even trying. One afternoon, as Apollo and Hyacinthus were throwing the discus, laughing together in the countryside, the west wind decided to strike. If he could not have Hyacinthus, then Apollo would not either. As Apollo hurled the heavy disc, Zephyrus blew hard, catching it mid-flight and redirecting it toward the youth he had once loved. The heavy bronze disc struck Hyacinthus in the head with a sickening thud. Apollo rushed to the fallen prince, desperate, calling upon every healing power he possessed. He tried to close the wound, to stop the bleeding, even calling upon his father Zeus for help, but the injury was too severe. Hyacinthus died in Apollo's arms, with the god powerless to help him. From the blood that spilled on the ground, Apollo made a flower grow, the hyacinth. In this way, the prince's name would live on, bringing beauty to the world in the flowers that bloomed each spring. Apollo fathered numerous children across the centuries, but among them all, one would stand out for both his gifts and his misfortune. Asclepius was born to the mortal woman Coronis, but before the child's birth, Apollo discovered that Coronis had been unfaithful to him. In his rage, he had killed her, but at the last moment, as her body burned on the funeral pyre, he cut the unborn child from her womb and saved him. Apollo gave Asclepius to the centaur Chiron, a wise teacher who would raise many of Greece's greatest heroes. Under Chiron's tutelage, Asclepius learned the healing arts, soon proving to have a skill at medicine unmatched by any other. He could cure any disease, mend any wound, and treat any ailment. His reputation spread across Greece, and people came from every corner of the world seeking his help. But Asclepius made the mistake of succeeding too well. He was so skilled that soon he could even resurrect the dead, restoring life to those who had already crossed into Hades's realm. This could not be tolerated. Death was meant to be final, the one certainty that governed mortal existence. If the dead could be brought back at will, the entire cosmic order would collapse. Hades complained to Zeus that the underworld was being deprived of souls, and Zeus, recognizing the danger, struck down Asclepius with a thunderbolt. Apollo was devastated. His son had committed no crime except being too skilled in the art of healing, a profession that benefited all. In his grief, Apollo killed the Cyclopes, the craftsmen who had forged Zeus's thunderbolt, reasoning that without them, Zeus could not strike down anyone else Apollo cared about. This act of revenge could not go unpunished. Zeus nearly cast Apollo down to Tartarus alongside the Titans, but Leto interceded, begging for mercy for her son. After much deliberation, Zeus finally relented, but would still impose a punishment. Apollo would serve as a mortal shepherd for a year, tending the flocks of King Admetus of Pherae. He would be stripped of his divine powers, experiencing firsthand the fragility and hardship of mortal life. After Apollo completed his servitude and returned to Olympus, he found that Zeus's heart had softened under Leto's many pleas. The king of the gods resurrected Asclepius and granted him immortality, transforming him into the god of healing and medicine. But the new god was forbidden from raising the dead. He could heal the living, but once someone had crossed into Hades's realm, they must remain there. Asclepius went on to father many children who continued his legacy. His daughter Hygeia became the goddess of cleanliness and preventative health, and from her name we derive our word hygiene. His temples, called Asclepieia, became healing centers throughout the ancient world, where the sick would come to sleep, hoping the god would visit them in their dreams and reveal the cure for their ailments. Artemis, the elder twin, was in many ways her brother's opposite. Where Apollo represented civilization, music, and prophecy, the ordered intellectual aspects of divinity, Artemis embodied wildness, instinct, and independence. She was the goddess of the hunt, running through the forests with her pack of hunting dogs, her silver bow always at hand, utterly without mercy toward those who displeased her. She was also the goddess of the moon, complementing her brother's association with light. She shared dominion over the moon with Selene, the Titaness who drove the lunar chariot across the heavens each night. Selene was the moon's physical embodiment, but Artemis commanded its spiritual essence, the power that drew the tides, the nocturnal hunts, and the women who gave birth beneath its silver glow. From childhood, Artemis had made her wishes clear to Zeus. She asked for eternal virginity, the permission to never marry, and the freedom to roam wild places. Zeus granted all three requests, and Artemis became one of three virgin goddesses on Olympus, alongside Athena and Hestia. But where Hestia's virginity was peaceful and Athena's pragmatic, Artemis's was fierce. She protected her chastity with violence, and anyone who violated it, or even witnessed it accidentally, faced terrible punishment. The hunter Actaeon, grandson of the famous hero Cadmus, was both skilled and successful, possessing 50 hunting dogs that obeyed his every command. He was pious enough to honor Artemis and make offerings before his hunts. But piety alone does not protect mortals from tragic accidents. One hot afternoon, after a successful morning hunt, Actaeon's dogs chased a deer deep into the forest. Actaeon followed, pushing through underbrush and around trees until he emerged into a hidden grotto where a clear pool sparkled in the sunlight. And there, bathing in the pool, surrounded by her nymphs, was Artemis. She was naked, vulnerable in a way goddesses should never be seen. The nymphs shrieked and tried to shield her with their bodies, but Actaeon had already seen. For a frozen moment, hunter and goddess stared at each other, both shocked, neither moving. Actaeon had not sought this. He had not come looking for the goddess. He had simply followed his dogs and stumbled into the wrong place at the wrong time, but intent did not matter. He had seen Artemis naked, witnessed what no mortal man was permitted to see, and there could be only one response. Artemis threw water at him, and where the droplets struck his skin, transformation began. His nose stretched into a snout, his ears grew long and moved to the top of his head. Antlers erupted from his skull, and his hands became hooves. His body shrank and reshaped until where a man had stood, a deer now stood in his place. Actaeon tried to cry out to apologize and try to explain, but all that emerged was a deer's frightened bleating, and then he heard them. His own dogs, 50 beasts he had trained himself, responding to the sound of prey. They came crashing through the underbrush, baying with excitement, having caught the scent of a deer. Actaeon ran. His new deer body was fast, but his dogs were trained hunters, and they knew these woods as well as he did. They pursued him with the same dedication he had taught them, the same refusal to quit that had made them successful. They caught him at the edge of a clearing. The lead dog leapt and brought him down. The others followed instantly, and 50 sets of jaws tore into him. Actaeon died as he had killed so many animals before, brought down by the pack, suffering the same terror and pain he had inflicted on countless prey. Artemis watched from the tree line, unmoved by Actaeon's suffering. He had seen what he should not have seen. The punishment was just. She returned to her pool to finish bathing, leaving the hunter's torn body as a warning to anyone else who might violate her privacy. There was only one man who ever caught Artemis's attention, testing her vows of celibacy as none would before or after. Orion was a giant, a great hunter who stood taller than any mortal man, with his skill with a bow and spear rivaling even Artemis's own. Artemis encountered him while hunting and was immediately taken by his abilities. Here was a hunter who understood the wild as she did, who moved through the forest with the same natural grace, who could track prey by the smallest signs. They began hunting together, ranging across Greece, and for the first time in her immortal life, Artemis found herself drawn to a companion who could match her in the pursuits she valued most. Their hunts stretched longer, their conversations deepened, and Orion's confidence grew with each successful kill. One day, overcome by his own success, Orion made a boast that would prove fatal. "I am the greatest hunter alive," he declared to anyone who would listen. "I could hunt every creature on earth, kill every beast that walks or flies or swims. I could empty the entire world of animals if I so choose." The words reached Gaia, the earth herself, mother of all living things. When she heard a mortal was threatening to slaughter her children, her anger could not be contained. From beneath the earth, she summoned a massive scorpion, its carapace black as night, its stinger dripping with a venom that could kill even the gods. The scorpion found Orion on a beach in Crete. He drew his weapons and fought bravely, his spear striking the creature's shell again and again, but the armor was too thick. The scorpion's pincers caught him, and its stinger plunged into his back. Artemis arrived too late. She found Orion dying on the sand, the venom already spreading through his veins. She knelt beside him, but there was nothing she could do. The poison was beyond even divine healing. When Orion died, Artemis took his body and placed it among the stars as a constellation, forever hunting across the heavens, and she placed the scorpion there too, as Scorpius, eternally pursuing the hunter across the sky. On summer nights, you can watch Orion rise in the east and set in the west, and as he disappears below the horizon, Scorpius rises behind him, forever chasing. The pattern of that fatal hunt repeated endlessly in the stars above. Athena, goddess of wisdom and strategic warfare, had entered the world in the most unusual way imaginable. Born fully grown from Zeus's head after he swallowed her mother, Metis, she had emerged already armored, already wise, and prepared to take her place among the Olympians. She became one of the 3 virgin goddesses of Olympus, alongside Artemis and Hestia, dedicating herself not to marriage, but to the pursuits of the mind and the art of warfare. But her approach to war was nothing like her half-brother Ares, who reveled in bloodshed, and her chaos. Athena valued strategy over slaughter, discipline over rage. She was the goddess generals prayed to before battle, the deity who favored cunning over brute force. Beyond warfare, Athena's gifts to humanity were numerous and lasting. She was credited with inventing mathematics, teaching mortals how to work with numbers and measure the world around them. She created the first loom, and became patron of weavers and craftsmen. Potters shaped their clay under her watchful eye, while shipbuilders constructed their vessels according to principles she had revealed. Civilization itself, in many ways, owed its advancement to Athena's guidance. But for all her wisdom and all her gifts to humanity, Athena was also a proud goddess, being quick to anger when her honor was challenged. Those who competed with her or insulted her achievements learned that wisdom and cruelty could exist in the same divine heart, and that the goddess who helped heroes could also destroy mortals who overstepped their bounds. After her birth, Athena looked down at the mortal world, searching for a city she could claim as her own. She quickly noticed a city in eastern Greece that had no patron deity to protect it and receive its worship. The city was prosperous, well-positioned, with a high rocky outcrop that would make a perfect acropolis, a sacred space for temples and sanctuaries. This city, she decided, would be hers. But Poseidon had noticed the same thing. The god of the seas saw the city's excellent harbor and its potential as a naval power. He too wanted to claim it as his own, to be honored there as the primary deity. The dispute between uncle and niece grew heated, and to prevent open conflict, Zeus decreed that there would be a competition. Each god would present a gift to the city, and its citizens would vote to determine their patron. The citizens gathered at the base of the rocky outcrop, looking up at where the two gods stood with the rest of the Olympians watching from above. Poseidon went first. He raised his trident high and struck the rock with a tremendous force. The earth shook. A crack appeared in the stone, and from that crack burst a spring, water surging upward in a fountain that caught the sunlight and created rainbows in its spray. The citizens gasped, impressed by the display of power. Water was life after all, and a spring in the city would be valuable beyond measure. But as some of the citizens approached to taste the water, their expressions changed. The water was salty, drawn up from the sea by Poseidon's power. It could not be drunk or used to water crops. It was impressive to look at, certainly, but ultimately useless for the city's actual needs. Then Athena stepped forward. She did not raise her spear or make any dramatic gestures. She simply knelt and placed her palm flat against the earth. Where her hand pressed the soil, something began to grow. A shoot emerged, then a trunk, then branches spreading wide, leaves unfurled, silver green and rustling in the breeze. And within moments, the first olive tree stood where nothing had been before, its branches heavy with fruit. The citizens approached slowly, uncertain what they were seeing. Athena picked the fruit from the branches and showed them how to press the olives to extract oil. This oil, she explained, could be used for cooking, for fueling lamps, for medicine, and for perfume. Not only this, but the wood of the tree was hard and useful for building, while the leaves could feed livestock. And unlike Poseidon's spring, which would produce the same salty water year after year without change, the olive tree would produce fruit annually, a renewable gift that would continue giving long after the initial planting. The choice was obvious. The citizens voted unanimously for Athena's gift. The city took her name and became Athens, destined to become the intellectual and cultural center of Greece, home to philosophers and playwrights, democracy and law. The olive tree she planted remained on the Acropolis, sacred and protected, and soon olive trees spread across the entire Greek world, becoming essential to all aspects of life. Athena's skill at weaving was legendary. She had invented the loom with tapestries, created under her guidance, considered the finest in existence. When mortals wanted to honor her, they often did so by weaving intricate cloths, depicting her victories and virtues, offering these works at her temples as the highest form of flattery. In Lydia, there lived a young woman named Arachne, whose talent at the loom was extraordinary. She could weave images so lifelike that birds would fly down to peck at the woven flowers, thinking them real. Her tapestries were sought after across the Greek world, and people traveled great distances to watch her work or commission pieces. But talent brought pride, and pride brought foolishness. When people praised Arachne's weaving, she began to believe she had surpassed even divine skill. "I am the greatest weaver in existence," she boasted. "My work exceeds even that of Athena herself. If the goddess doubts me, let her come and prove her superiority." When word of these boasts reached Olympus, Athena descended to Lydia without hesitation. She did not come in her true form. Instead, she disguised herself as an old woman, hunched and grey-haired, leaning on a walking stick. She found Arachne in her workshop, surrounded by admirers, and spoke in an aged voice. "Young woman, I have heard of your great skill, but I have also heard your boasts. Take advice from one who has lived for a long time. Pride comes before a fall. Apologize to Athena, beg her forgiveness, and perhaps she will show you mercy." Arachne laughed at the old woman. "Who are you to lecture me? I speak only the truth. My skill is unmatched. If Athena disagrees, let her face me in competition instead of sending old crones to scold me." The disguise fell away. The old woman straightened, growing taller, her grey hair turning dark, her aged face becoming young and terrible in its beauty. Athena stood revealed, her grey eyes cold with anger. "You wish to compete with me," the goddess said. "Very well. We will each create a tapestry. Let the work speak for itself." 2 looms were set up side by side. Both weavers took their places. For hours they worked in silence, their fingers flying across the threads, patterns emerging with breathtaking speed and complexity. Athena wove a tapestry depicting the contest for Athens, showing her victory over Poseidon, her olive tree growing strong and fruitful. In the 4 corners, she added warning scenes, mortals who had challenged gods and suffered for their hubris, each one transformed or destroyed as punishment for their arrogance. The message was clear. Arachne, either blind to the warning or too proud to heed it, chose a different subject. She wove scenes of the gods' misdeeds and failures, Zeus transforming animals to seduce mortal women, Poseidon's assaults on unwilling nymphs, Apollo's romantic failures. Every divine scandal and shame she could think of, she depicted in exquisite detail. Her tapestry was technically flawless, each figure perfectly rendered, every divine disgrace composed with artistic brilliance. When both tapestries were complete, they hung side by side for judgment. When Athena stepped back to examine Arachne's work, what she saw made her blood run cold. To display the gods' misdeeds and failures so openly was unthinkable, an insult from which there was no forgiveness. But what truly angered Athena, what made her rage reach levels it never had before, was that Arachne's work was undeniably better than her own. The composition was flawless, the needlework immaculate, with Athena's piece almost bland in comparison. "You wanted to prove your skill," Athena said, her voice dangerously quiet. "You have succeeded. Your work is," she paused, struggling to get the words out, "superior to mine." For a moment, Arachne smiled, thinking she had won. "But you have forgotten," Athena continued. "That skill without wisdom is worthless, and you have just demonstrated spectacular foolishness." Her hand rose, divine power crackling around her fingers. "You should have let me win." Athena's fury exploded. She tore Arachne's tapestry from the loom, ripping it to shreds, destroying the masterpiece in seconds. Arachne cried out, reaching for her work, and Athena seized the weaving shuttle and struck her across the head with it. Once, twice, 3 times. Arachne fell to the floor, stunned and bleeding, but death would be too merciful. As Arachne lay there, her body began to change. It shrank, her limbs multiplying, her torso becoming round and compact. Where a young woman had sprawled moments before, the first spider now huddled in fear. "You wish to weave for eternity," Athena said to the spider. "So you shall. You and all your descendants will weave beautiful creations, but they will be destroyed as quickly as you make them, blown away by wind or swept aside by brooms. Your name will live on, though. Every spider and web spinner will be called Arachnid, so that mortals never forget what happens to those who challenge the gods." The spider that had been Arachne scuttled into a corner, already beginning to spin, unable to stop herself. And from that day forward, spiders have woven their webs with the same skill Arachne possessed in life, creating patterns of geometric perfection, only to watch them destroyed again and again for the rest of time. Poseidon, brother of Zeus, ruled the seas from his magnificent palace beneath the waves. The palace was built of coral and pearls, its halls filled with the treasures of 1,000 sunken ships. From this underwater kingdom, Poseidon commanded all the waters of the earth, the endless oceans, the roaring rivers, and the quiet lakes hidden in mountain valleys. He was known as the Earth Shaker, for with a single strike of his trident against the ocean floor, he could create earthquakes that toppled cities and reshaped coastlines. When he traveled across his domain, he rode in a golden chariot pulled by hippocampi, creatures with the front halves of horses and the back halves of fish, their hooves striking the waves and leaving trails of foam in their wake. As he passed, the waters would calm or rage according to his mood, and sailors learned to read the sea carefully, knowing that Poseidon's temper was as changeable as the tides themselves. He had taken Amphitrite, a sea nymph and daughter of the Titan Oceanus, as his queen. She ruled the seas beside him, her power over the oceans calm, nearly as great as his power over its storms. But like his brother Zeus, Poseidon's eye wandered constantly to other women, nymphs, goddesses, and mortals alike. And Amphitrite learned to live with a husband whose desires were as vast and restless as the sea itself. Poseidon's temper was legendary, with him being as volatile as the sea he ruled. He held grudges with the intensity of a whirlpool, never forgetting a slight, never forgiving an insult. Those who offended him could expect punishment not just for themselves, but for their children and their children's children. One of Poseidon's most terrible punishments would take place on Crete, the largest Greek island located south of the mainland. Minos, king of Crete, had prayed to Poseidon for a sign that would prove his right to the throne over his brothers. Poseidon answered by sending a magnificent white bull from the sea, an animal so perfect that everyone who saw it recognized it as a gift from the gods. The agreement was simple. Minos would sacrifice the bull back to Poseidon as an offering of gratitude and respect. Minos took the throne as Poseidon had intended. But when the time came to sacrifice the white bull, the king could not bring himself to do it. The animal was too valuable, too impressive to kill. Surely, Minos reasoned, Poseidon would not miss one bull. The god must have more important concerns than tracking every sacrifice. He kept the white bull for himself and sacrificed a lesser animal from his own herds, hoping the god would not notice or would not care. But Poseidon noticed, and he cared. The god's revenge was both creative and horrifying. He could have struck Minos down with an earthquake or drowned his fleet. Instead, he chose a punishment that would bring lasting shame to the king's household. He made Minos's wife, Queen Pasiphae, fall desperately in love with the white bull. The curse was absolute. Pasiphae's desire was overwhelming, her urges impossible to resist. In her madness, she sought out Daedalus, a renowned inventor and craftsman, and begged him to help her. Daedalus, unable to refuse a queen's command, no matter how disturbing, built a hollow wooden cow, covered in real hide. Pasiphae climbed inside, and the white bull, deceived by the construction, mated with what he believed was a real cow. From this union came the Minotaur, a creature with the body of a man and the head of a bull. The child was monstrous and violent, with an insatiable hunger for human flesh. Minos, horrified by what his wife had borne and what it revealed about his broken oath, ordered Daedalus to build a labyrinth beneath the palace, a maze so complex that nothing could ever escape from it. There he imprisoned the Minotaur, feeding it criminals and captives, hiding his shame in the darkness below his throne. Poseidon's message was clear: break your oaths to the gods, and the consequences will haunt your bloodline for generations. The creature would remain in its labyrinth for decades, until a young Athenian hero named Theseus came to slay it. Aphrodite, goddess of love and beauty, had the strangest birth of all the Olympians. When Cronus castrated his father Uranus and cast the severed genitals into the sea, Aphrodite rose from where the flesh landed, born not of a mother's womb, but from violence and ocean spray. This made her older than Zeus and all the Olympians who had come to rule from Mount Olympus. She commanded love in all its forms, from the most passionate desires to the tenderest of affections. When she wished it, the most devoted spouse would stray. When she blessed a union, even the unlikeliest lovers would find happiness together. Both mortals and gods fell under her influence. For love answered to Aphrodite alone, and she wielded that power with a mixture of generosity and mischief that made her both beloved and feared. She was often accompanied by her son, Eros, the young god of desire, who carried a bow and arrows that could pierce any heart. Where Aphrodite represented love's broader power, beauty, attraction, and the bonds between people, Eros embodied its most immediate and uncontrollable aspect, sudden overwhelming desire. His golden-tipped arrows caused helpless infatuation, while his lead-tipped arrows created revulsion. Together, mother and son moved through the world like artists with a canvas, painting love and heartbreak across the lives of mortals and immortals alike, sometimes for noble purposes, sometimes simply because it amused them. Among mortals, few attracted as much attention as Narcissus, a young man whose beauty was so extraordinary that people would stop in the street simply to watch him pass. Eros, at Aphrodite's direction, shot his golden arrows into the hearts of countless admirers, men and women both, who found themselves helplessly drawn to him. But while Narcissus had been blessed with great beauty, he had been burdened with even greater vanity. He knew his own worth, and found everyone else lacking by comparison. When admirers confessed their love, he mocked them. When they offered gifts, he turned them away with cruel words. He took pleasure in rejection, in watching others suffer for wanting what he would never give. Love to Narcissus was something other people felt, a weakness that he was fortunate enough to lack. One day, he encountered the nymph Echo in the forest. She had been following him for weeks, working up the courage to speak to him, rehearsing what she might say. But Echo suffered under a terrible curse, one that made conversation impossible. The curse had come from Hera. Zeus, as always, had been pursuing nymphs in the forest, and Echo had deliberately delayed Hera with endless chatter, distracting the queen of the gods with stories and gossip, while Zeus's lovers escaped. When Hera finally realized the deception, she punished the talkative nymph with a terrible curse. Echo could no longer speak her own words. She could only repeat the last words spoken to her, being forever unable to initiate conversation. When Echo finally approached Narcissus, stepping out from behind a tree where she had been watching him, he noticed her immediately. "Who is over there?" he called out. "There," Echo repeated, a voice soft and sad. "Come here," Narcissus commanded. "Here," she replied, stepping closer, hope rising in her chest. "Why do you follow me?" he demanded. "Follow me," she echoed, reaching out toward him. Narcissus understood then what was happening, and he laughed, the sound cold and mocking. "I would rather die than let you touch me," he said, and walked away, leaving her standing alone in the forest. "Touch me," Echo whispered to his retreating back, the words breaking her heart. She fled into the mountains, devastated by the cruelty of loving someone who mocked her so mercilessly. She stopped eating or sleeping, no longer caring whether she lived or died. Slowly her body wasted away until nothing physical remained, but her voice survived and can still be heard today. Every echo in every mountain valley, every reflected sound in a great hall or cave is Echo herself, eternally repeating the words of others, forever trapped in the moment of her heartbreak. Her suffering, however, would not go unpunished. Nemesis, goddess of retribution, had been watching. She saw how Narcissus treated those who loved him, how he turned devotion into a joke. Such arrogance demanded punishment, and Nemesis decided the punishment should fit the crime perfectly. The next time Narcissus walked through the forest, Nemesis guided his steps to a clear pool hidden among the trees, its water so still it reflected like polished metal. Thirsty from his walk, Narcissus knelt at the water's edge to drink, and there, in the reflection, he saw the most beautiful face he had ever encountered. The young man looking back at him was perfect. Every feature was flawless. The eyes were deep and soulful. The face was noble and kind. For the first time in his life, Narcissus felt what all his admirers had felt: overwhelming desire, the desperate need to touch and be touched by someone beautiful. He reached toward the water, and the beautiful face reached back. Their fingers met on the surface, and the image shattered into ripples. Narcissus pulled back, confused, and waited for the water to still. The face returned, smiling at him, and he reached again. Again the image broke. Again he waited. "Please," he whispered to the reflection, "do not run from me. Everyone else has, but not you. You are different. You are perfect." The reflection smiled back, but said nothing. Narcissus could not leave. He tried once, stood up and took a few steps away, but the thought of never seeing that beautiful face again was unbearable. He returned to the pool and knelt there, gazing at the only person he would ever love. Days passed. He did not eat. He did not sleep. He simply stared into the water, begging the beautiful man to step out of the pool and into his arms. Slowly it began to dawn on him what he was looking at, and why that love could never be fulfilled. "It is me," he said to the reflection. "You are me. I have fallen in love with myself." The reflection looked back at him, sadness falling over its features. "I will never have you," Narcissus said, "and I cannot live without you." He drew a dagger from his belt, took one last look at the beautiful face in the water, and plunged the blade into his heart. He fell forward, the blood spilling onto the earth around the pool, and in moments he was dead. Where his blood touched the soil, a flower grew, white petals with a golden center, forever bending toward its own reflection in the water. The first Narcissus bloomed there by the pool, and from his name came another word, narcissist, describing those who love only themselves, seeing others as mere mirrors, to reflect their own beauty. While some mortals destroyed themselves with love, others found themselves destroyed by it against their will, and sometimes even gods discovered that love brought pain they could not control. Aphrodite, who had been the cause of countless love stories across the generations, would find herself caught in one when she fell in love with a mortal man named Adonis. He was a young and gifted hunter, and he caught the goddess's eye like few had before. Aphrodite began to spend more and more time away from Olympus, wandering the mortal world in his company, hunting with him during the day, and lying with him at night. For the first time in her existence, Aphrodite felt what she usually inflicted on others: complete devotion. She was unable to think of anything else, neglecting her duties for a few more hours in her lover's presence. The other gods began to notice, although none more than Ares, god of war and Aphrodite's frequent lover. Ares had seen Aphrodite take lovers before. It was something almost inevitable for the goddess of love. But there was something about her relationship with Adonis that made him uneasy. For her to look at another man with such tenderness and affection, and a mortal at that, made his skin crawl. The war god's jealousy burned hot and violent, and he decided that if Aphrodite wanted a mortal lover, she should learn what it meant to love something that could be so easily destroyed. Ares transformed himself into a massive boar and began tracking Adonis through the forest. The young hunter never stood a chance. The boar charged from the underbrush while Adonis was checking his traps, and its tusks tore through his thigh, severing the great artery there. Adonis fell, blood spreading across the forest floor, and the boar disappeared back into the trees. Aphrodite felt the moment it happened. She was on Olympus, speaking with another goddess, and suddenly felt a tightness in her chest that she could not explain. She abandoned the conversation mid-sentence and flew to the forest, where she had left Adonis. That morning, she found him lying beneath an oak tree, his skin already pale, his breathing shallow. He looked up at her and tried to smile, but his strength would not allow it. Aphrodite knelt beside him, her hands fluttering uselessly over his wounds, trying to heal what could not be healed. She held him as his breathing stopped, and Adonis slipped away into the darkness that claimed all mortal things. The grief Aphrodite felt was profound. She had watched mortals weep over lost loved ones countless times, and finally she understood that pain herself. Looking down at the blood-soaked ground, she touched the earth where his blood had fallen, and a new type of flower began to grow. Anemones, red as the blood he had spilled, delicate and beautiful, and lasting only a short time before their petals fell. Every spring they would bloom again, a reminder that beauty was precious precisely because it could not last forever. But while some found love and lost it, others spent their lives searching and found it in the most unexpected places. Pygmalion was a sculptor from the island of Cyprus, renowned for his skill in carving marble and ivory into lifelike forms. But for all his talent, Pygmalion was profoundly lonely. He had loved before, and it had always ended badly. He had been hurt enough times that he had given up entirely, resigning himself to a life of solitude, pouring all his passion and energy into his art instead. One day he began work on a new statue, a woman carved from the purest white marble. He worked without a clear vision of what she should be, simply letting his hands shape the stone according to some instinct deep inside him. Hours became days, days became weeks, and slowly the figure emerged. He carved her face with meticulous care, shaping her slender features, the gentle curve of her cheek, the slight smile on her lips. He worked on her hair for days, each lock carved separately, flowing down her shoulders in waves that looked like they might move in a breeze. Her body was perfect in its proportions, neither too idealized nor too plain, real, in a way his other statues had never been. When he finally stepped back to examine the completed work, Pygmalion felt his heart stop. The woman before him was more beautiful than anyone he had ever seen, but more than that, she looked kind, she looked intelligent, she looked like someone he would want to know, someone with whom he wanted to strike up a conversation and speak with. He began spending all his time in the workshop, sitting beside the statue for hours, holding its cold marble hand and talking to it as if it could hear him. The loneliness he had tried to bury in his work came roaring back worse than ever, because now he had seen exactly what he wanted, and knew he could never find it. He had created the perfect woman, and she was made of stone. Night after night, Pygmalion knelt before the statue and prayed to Aphrodite. "Goddess," he begged, "if you have any mercy, give me a woman like this one. Let me find someone with her kindness and her grace. I am not asking for the impossible, I'm only asking for someone as perfect as what I have imagined." Aphrodite heard his prayers, and they touched something in her that had been raw since Adonis's death. Here was a man who had been hurt by love, but still believed in it enough to pray for it. Here was someone who had created beauty, not to show off his skill, but because he genuinely longed for connection. It was a devotion worth rewarding. One evening, as Pygmalion knelt beside his creation, the statue began to change. The marble grew warm and soft to the touch. Color spread across its surface, while the stone hair softened into actual strands. When Pygmalion finally looked up and saw the statue's chest rising and falling with breath, he stumbled backward, certain that loneliness had finally driven him mad. But the woman, no longer stone, but flesh and blood, smiled at him, a real smile that moved real lips. "Hello," she said, her voice soft and warm. "My name is Galatea." She stepped down from the pedestal, her hand reaching for his. Pygmalion took it, felt the warmth of her skin, and began to weep. Aphrodite had not simply granted him a woman like his statue. She had brought the statue itself to life, giving him the perfect companion he had created. During his lowest moment of loneliness and despair, they would marry, living long and happy lives together, and producing children who would go on to found kingdoms. But in that first moment, when Galatea was newly alive, and Pygmalion was holding someone real instead of stone, Aphrodite watched from Olympus and smiled. Sometimes she thought love deserved a happy ending, but Aphrodite's capacity for love was matched by her capacity for jealousy. She demanded worship and adoration, and when mortals forgot to honor her properly, her revenge could be as cruel as any Olympian's. There once lived a mortal woman named Psyche, whose beauty was so extraordinary that people began to worship her instead of Aphrodite. They would travel from distant lands just to glimpse her face, bringing offerings as if she were divine. Temples to Aphrodite stood empty, whilst crowds gathered around Psyche's home, calling her the new goddess of beauty. Furious, Aphrodite summoned Eros and demanded that he make Psyche fall in love with the most hideous creature he could find. But when Eros flew down and saw Psyche sleeping, he too was struck by her beauty. He had made countless mortals fall in love, but had never felt the emotion himself. That changed the moment he saw her. Unable to defy his mother openly, but unwilling to harm Psyche, Eros devised a plan that would allow them to be together without Aphrodite's knowledge. Through dreams and oracles, he arranged for Psyche to be taken to a mountain peak and left there as a bride for a mysterious husband. When she arrived, the west wind carried her gently down to a hidden valley where a magnificent palace waited, filled with invisible servants who attended to her every need. Each night, her husband came to her in complete darkness. His voice was kind, his touch gentle, and Psyche grew to love him deeply. But he made her promise one thing: she must never try to see his face. For a time, they were happy, but Psyche's sisters, jealous of her good fortune, planted seeds of doubt. "What if he is a monster?" they whispered. "What if he hides his face because he is too terrible to look upon?" Their words ate at her, until curiosity and fear overwhelmed her promise. One night, after her husband had fallen asleep beside her, Psyche lit an oil lamp and held it over him. Instead of a monster, she saw the most beautiful being she had ever beheld, Eros himself, the god of love, with golden wings folded against his back. However, in her excitement, Psyche lost her grip on the lamp, with the hot oil falling down onto Eros's shoulder, causing the god to wake up in fright. "You have broken your promise," he said, his voice filled with sorrow. "Love cannot survive without trust." His wings unfurled and he flew from the palace, disappearing into the night sky. Psyche was left alone in the valley, the palace and its servants vanishing as if they had never existed. Desperate to win back her husband, she began searching for him, traveling from temple to temple, begging the gods for help. But none would assist her, for all feared Aphrodite's wrath. Finally, with nowhere else to turn, she presented herself at Aphrodite's temple, begging the goddess for a chance to see Eros once again. "You dare come before me?" The goddess laughed, delighted to see a rival reduced to begging. "Very well. If you wish to prove yourself worthy of a god, you will complete whatever tasks I set for you." The goddess devised a series of impossible labors. Psyche was forced to sort an enormous pile of mixed grains before dawn, to gather golden wool from a group of violent rams, and to collect water from an unreachable spring. Each time, through cleverness and unexpected help, ants sorting the grains, reeds telling her how to gather the wool safely, and an eagle fetching the water, she succeeded. Aphrodite's anger only grew with each success. Finally, she devised a task she was certain would kill the mortal girl. She held out a small golden box. "Take this to the underworld. Present yourself before Persephone, queen of the dead, and ask her to place a small portion of her beauty inside this box. Then return the box to me, unopened." Psyche took the box, despair threatening to overwhelm her, certain that this task would be her end. But then she thought of Eros, of the love they had once had, and forced herself to go forward. Traveling to the underworld, Psyche came to the river Styx, paying Charon, the eternal ferryman, to take her across its black waters. Cerberus, the three-headed hound that guarded the gates of death, would be her next obstacle, but she had come prepared. Taking out a piece of barley cake hidden in her robes, she threw it before the monstrous guardian, slipping by as all three heads fought over the morsel. Finally arriving in the throne room of Hades's palace, she found Persephone waiting for her. The queen of the dead understood immediately what Aphrodite was doing. This cruel test, designed to kill a mortal girl whose only crime was her beauty. Persephone took the box and disappeared into an inner chamber. When she returned, the box was sealed. "Give this to Aphrodite," she said, "and girl, be wise. Curiosity is a dangerous thing in matters involving the gods." Psyche bowed deeply and began her return journey, moving past Cerberus, across the Styx, and up through the darkness and into the sunlight. But as she walked away from the realm of death, a thought began to form. A fragment of Persephone's beauty was contained in this box. What if Psyche used just a tiny portion herself? Surely, if she appeared more beautiful, Eros would be more likely to forgive her. Just a small amount. No one would notice. She opened the box. Whatever was inside was never meant for mortal eyes. A great cloud rose from the box and enveloped her, and the sleep of the dead took hold. She collapsed onto the path, neither fully alive nor fully dead, trapped in the deathly slumber that had been placed inside. She might have lain there forever, slowly becoming part of the earth, if Eros had not been watching. His love for her had never truly faded, and seeing all she had endured to prove herself worthy of him, his heart finally softened. He descended on golden wings and gathered the sleep back into the box. "Oh, Psyche," he whispered, "you have suffered so much for loving me." He touched her face gently. "Wake up, my love." Her eyes opened. Eros helped her stand and told her to deliver the box and complete her task. When she did, Aphrodite could find no reason to keep them apart any longer. Eros brought Psyche before Zeus and the assembled gods, and they were married properly. Zeus gave Psyche ambrosia to drink, making her immortal so she could remain with Eros forever. And so it was that Psyche, whose name means soul, would become a goddess. In her union with Eros, love and soul would now be forever linked with their child, Hedone, the goddess of pleasure, bringing joy to mortals across the earth. Hephaestus, god of smithing and fire, had the most painful beginning of any Olympian. He was born from Hera alone, conceived by her as revenge for Zeus birthing Athena from his own head. But where Athena had emerged perfect and fully formed, Hephaestus came into the world twisted and lame, his legs malformed. Hera took one look at her son and saw only failure. She wanted to prove she could create life as Zeus had, but instead she had produced a crippled child, an embarrassment before the other gods. In her shame, she seized the infant and hurled him from the heights of Olympus before any of the other gods could see, casting him down toward the sea far below. But Hephaestus survived the fall. He plunged into the ocean and sank deep beneath the surface, where he was found by the sea nymphs Thetis and Eurynome. They took pity on the broken, crying infant and brought him to an underwater grotto, a hidden cave lit by volcanic vents, where the water was warm and the stone glowed red with heat. There, in that secret sanctuary beneath the waves, Hephaestus grew up. The nymphs cared for him, and as he matured, he discovered that he had a gift that transcended his physical limitations. He could work metal like no one else. He understood fire and forge in ways that seemed almost instinctive. He began crafting jewelry for his foster mothers, with his skill growing with each passing year until he became a master craftsman, the greatest the world had ever known. But he never forgot what his real mother had done. The memory of Hera's rejection was a burden he always carried, and when he had finally perfected his art, Hephaestus decided it was time to return to Olympus and claim what should have been his from birth. He crafted a gift for Hera to mark his return, a magnificent golden throne, the craftsmanship more beautiful than anything already on Olympus. He sent it to her ahead of his arrival, and Hera was delighted by such an exquisite gift, and perhaps feeling a twinge of guilt about the son she had cast away, sat upon it immediately. The moment she settled onto the throne, invisible chains sprang from the arms and locked around her wrists. Shackles wrapped around her ankles. She was trapped, held prisoner by her own son's masterwork. The gods tried everything to free her. They pulled the chains and struck them with weapons, but nothing worked. Only the throne's creator could release her. Zeus, desperate to free his wife, finally decided to send messengers to Hephaestus. The rejected son had conditions. He wanted his own place on Olympus, recognition as one of the gods, and above all, he wanted a bride. Not just any bride, but Aphrodite, the most beautiful goddess in existence. Zeus agreed without question. Hera was freed from the throne, and Aphrodite found herself married to a husband she had never chosen, bound to a god she felt nothing for. It was perhaps the cruelest irony on Olympus, the goddess of love trapped in a loveless marriage, given away like property to secure another's freedom. Hephaestus took his place among the 12 Olympians and established his workshop beneath Mount Etna in Sicily. There, in a vast forge chamber heated by the volcano's fire, he created wonders that would shape the fate of gods and heroes alike. He crafted Athena's aegis, Hermes' winged helmet and sandals, and the golden chariot that Helios drove across the sky each day. The Romans would know him as Vulcan, god of fire and forge. They said his workshop lay beneath Mount Etna, and when the volcano erupted with smoke and molten rock, it was simply Vulcan at work. The mountain's fury, nothing more than the byproduct of his divine forge. Ares, god of war, was perhaps the most hated deity on Olympus. Where Athena represented strategic warfare and disciplined combat, Ares embodied mindless violence, the bloodlust that turned battlefields into slaughterhouses. He delighted in the clash of armies, taking pleasure in the screams of the dying and the destruction of cities. Even the other gods despised him. Zeus, his own father, openly declared his hatred for his son. The other Olympians mocked Ares constantly and enjoyed playing tricks on him. He was strong, certainly, but he was also rash and easy to manipulate. In the stories of heroes, Ares appears again and again, and almost always he loses, humiliated by mortals and gods alike, who outsmart him or simply prove braver than the god of courage himself. But there was one place where Ares found welcome. In Aphrodite's bed, the goddess of love despised her husband. She had been given to him against her will, forced into marriage with a god she found physically repulsive. Ares, for all his flaws, was everything Hephaestus was not. Handsome and powerful, being almost physically perfect. When Hephaestus was away at his forge, Aphrodite would send for Ares, with the two spending hours together in pleasures that neither bothered to hide particularly well. Eventually, word reached Hephaestus with the god, feeling the old familiar burn of humiliation and rejection, emotions he had vowed to never let himself be subject to again. He returned to his forge and worked for days without rest. He crafted a net of bronze so fine it was invisible, each link so small and perfectly made that no one could see it, yet strong enough to hold even gods. He carried this net to his bedchamber and suspended it above the bed, concealed among the ceiling beams, with it ready to drop at his command. Then he announced loudly that he was leaving for several days to visit his workshop on Lemnos, making sure that everyone on Olympus heard the news. As expected, Aphrodite sent for Ares the moment Hephaestus was gone. The war god came eagerly, and the two fell into bed together, wrapped in each other's arms. It was then that Hephaestus, who had never actually left, triggered the mechanism. The invisible net fell, wrapping around the lovers, pinning them to the bed in a tangle of bronze mesh that tightened the more they struggled. "Help!" Ares roared, his face red with embarrassment. "Someone help us." But Hephaestus had already sent word throughout Olympus. The gods arrived one by one to witness the spectacle. Ares and Aphrodite, the god of war and the goddess of beauty, trapped naked in each other's arms, unable to hide what they had been doing. Laughter ran through the halls of Olympus. The gods who had mocked Ares for years found this the greatest joke of all. Mighty Ares, god of warfare, caught in a net like a fish, unable to break free despite all his strength. And Aphrodite, usually so graceful, exposed in the most undignified position imaginable. "Well," Apollo said, grinning, "at least now we know why Aphrodite puts up with him. At least he is good at one type of combat," Athena said with a smirk. "I would trade places with Ares in a heartbeat," Hermes added. "Hephaestus, can you let me in?" A fresh wave of laughter rolled across the heavens. The humiliation went on and on. Hephaestus stood to the side, his face unreadable, letting them laugh, letting them see. Finally, Poseidon stepped forward. He had pursued Aphrodite himself, once before Zeus gave her away, and he understood what it meant to want what you could not have. "Enough," Poseidon said. "Release them. You've made your point." Hephaestus had no desire to challenge Poseidon, and besides, the humiliation was complete. The net loosened and retracted, with Ares and Aphrodite fleeing from the room immediately, the gods laughing as they ran. The affair continued afterwards, though more carefully. In time, Hephaestus and Aphrodite reached an understanding. She respected his skill and treated him with courtesy in public. He accepted that forcing someone into marriage did not create love, and stopped trying to possess what could not be owned. They were not happy precisely, but they were no longer bitter. The marriage had become what many divine marriages were, a partnership of convenience between two powerful beings who had learned to coexist, if not to love. Aphrodite was not the only lover of Ares. The war god had also carried on an affair with Eos, the titaness of the dawn, she who rose through the sky each morning to clear the path for her brother Helios, allowing the sun to make its daily journey across the earth. When Aphrodite discovered this betrayal, for even gods who cheat grow jealous when cheated upon, she cursed Eos with uncontrollable desire for young mortal men. From that day forward, Eos could not look upon a handsome youth without being consumed by lust, stealing beautiful men from their homes and bringing them to her palace in the sky, keeping them until they aged or died, then seeking new ones to replace them. One morning her gaze fell upon the city of Troy, where she saw a young prince named Tithonus. She descended immediately, and Tithonus, flattered beyond measure that a goddess had noticed him, fell in love with her, as mortals often did with gods. What began as curse-driven lust slowly transformed into genuine affection, and Eos grew to love him truly. But as Eos grew to love him, she became tormented by a terrible awareness. Tithonus was mortal. He would age, and he would die. War might claim him, or disease, or any of the 1,000 ways mortal lives ended abruptly. The thought became unbearable. So she went to Zeus and begged for a favor. "Make him immortal," she pleaded. "Let him live forever so I need never lose him." Zeus, in a generous mood, granted the request without question. Tithonus became immortal. His life extended infinitely into the future. But Eos had made a fatal error. She had asked for immortality and forgotten to ask for eternal youth. At first the change was invisible. Tithonus remained young and handsome, and the years passed happily, but eventually grey began to appear in his hair, and lines formed around his eyes. He was aging, just as all mortals did, but unlike other mortals, he would never be granted the mercy of death at the end of it all. Decades passed and Tithonus became bent and frail, his limbs failing, his sight and hearing fading. Every moment was pain or confusion, and immortality meant his suffering would never end. Eos wept at what her request had created. She loved him still, but he had become something pitiable rather than beautiful. She took his fragile body and placed it in a grand chamber in her palace, somewhere safe from the outside world. Years passed, then decades, then centuries. Tithonus withered until he was little more than bones, still alive and aging, unable to die or truly live. His voice, once strong and clear, became a faint, endless chirping, the only sound he could still make. Finally, Eos could endure his suffering no longer. She transformed him into the first cicada, an insect known for its long lifespan and for the noise it makes during the early hours of the morning. To this day, cicadas sing at dawn when Eos rises into the sky. Their sound is a reminder of a prince who loved a goddess and received immortality as a gift only, to discover that living forever is not the blessing that it seems. Hermes, son of Zeus and the nymph Maia, was born in a cave on Mount Selene in Arcadia. He was the messenger god and the patron of travelers, thieves, and merchants, anyone who crossed boundaries or moved between worlds. Hermes traveled with a golden caduceus as a mark of his authority, a staff entwined with serpents and topped with wings. His winged helmet and sandals allowed him to fly between realms, carrying messages from Olympus to the far corners of the earth, and even down to the underworld itself. There he worked alongside Hades, acting as psychopomp, a guide for the souls of the dead, shepherding them as they made their way to the afterlife. But Hermes was most known as being a trickster among the Olympians, delighting in teasing his fellow divinities and playing pranks. With these tricks, starting on the day he was born, Hermes was born at dawn. By afternoon he had already escaped his cradle and was wandering the mountainside, and it was here that he noticed a herd of magnificent cattle grazing in a valley. Yet these were no ordinary cows. They were the prized herd of Apollo, god of music and prophecy. Hermes, despite still being an infant, decided he wanted them for himself. He drove the entire herd away from the valley, but he was careful to quite literally cover his tracks. He made the entire herd walk backwards, so their tracks blended into the many tracks, approaching the valley rather than those leading away from it. He then hid them in a cave, sacrificed 2 to the gods, and returned to his cradle, looking as innocent as any newborn. When Apollo discovered his cattle missing the next morning, he was furious. He followed the confusing tracks, his prophetic powers helping to guide the way, until he eventually traced the theft to the cave on Mount Selene. There he found the infant lying in his cradle, appearing to sleep peacefully. "Where are my cattle?" Apollo demanded. "Cattle," Hermes said, blinking up at him with innocent eyes. "I am but a baby born yesterday. How could I steal anything? Apollo was not fooled, and so dragged the infant before Zeus to settle the matter. But Hermes maintained his innocence with such charm that even Zeus had to hide a smile. Finally, Hermes admitted to the theft, but offered Apollo something in exchange. During his adventure, Hermes had found a tortoise, and with typical inventiveness, had fashioned its shell into a new instrument, the lyre. He had strung it with sheep's gut and discovered it could produce the most beautiful music when plucked. He offered this creation to Apollo as compensation for the cattle. Apollo, god of music, took the lyre and was immediately enchanted by its sound. He forgave Hermes for the theft on the spot, declared the infant a prodigy, and the two became the closest of friends. Zeus, impressed by his son's cunning, appointed Hermes as his official messenger, with the child taking his place among the Olympians, having earned his position through trickery on his very first day of existence. Among Hermes's many children, one would become beloved on Olympus, despite, or perhaps because of, his monstrous appearance. Pan, born to the nymph Dryope, had a human torso, but the legs, hooves, and horns of a goat. His mother fled in terror at the sight of him, but Hermes felt only affection for the strange child, and the gods of Olympus were charmed by his mischief and joyful laughter. Dionysus, god of wine and revelry, fell in love with the child immediately. He declared that the boy should be called Pan, meaning all, before he was beloved by all the gods of Olympus. Pan grew up to become the god of nature and shepherds, watching over flocks and wild creatures, and playing his music in lonely places where few mortals ventured. But like his father, Pan was known for pursuing nymphs across the land. One such nymph, Syrinx, caught his attention as she danced among the reeds near a riverbank. Pan approached her, declaring his love, but Syrinx wanted nothing to do with a goat-legged god. Terrified by his advances, she ran. Pan pursued her through the marshes, calling out to her, promising he meant no harm. But Syrinx only ran faster. When she reached the edge of a river with nowhere else to flee, she called out to the river nymphs for help. They answered her prayer by transforming her into a bed of water reeds, tall and indistinguishable from all the others growing along the shore. Pan reached the riverbank moments later, searching desperately through the reeds, tearing at them in his attempts to find her, but she was gone, lost among thousands of identical stalks. As he stood there in frustration, a breeze blew through the reeds, and they produced a sound unlike anything Pan had ever heard, a beautiful, haunting melody that seemed to carry Syrinx's voice. Inspired, Pan gathered several reeds of different lengths and bound them together with wax, creating an instrument. When he blew across the tops of the reeds, he could produce music, each reed creating a different note. He sat by the river and played a tune in memory of his lost love, and the sound was so beautiful that even the nymphs who had transformed Syrinx wept to hear it. The instrument became known as the Panpipes, and Pan carried it with him wherever he went, his music echoing through valleys and over hillsides. And from his name came another word, panic, the sudden unreasoning fear that strikes travelers in isolated places, the sense that something wild and unpredictable is watching from the shadows. Dionysus, god of wine and ecstasy, had one of the strangest births of any Olympian, and it began with Hera's jealousy and a mortal woman's tragic mistake. Semele, a princess of Thebes, was beautiful and noble, traits that caught Zeus's attention during one of his visits to the mortal world. He came to her in human form, and they began an affair that resulted in Semele becoming pregnant with his child. But Hera discovered the affair. As always, she could not punish Zeus himself, but she could destroy this mortal woman who had dared to share his bed. She disguised herself as an old nurse and befriended Semele, visiting often, offering advice about the pregnancy and gaining the young woman's trust. Finally, one day she planted a seed of doubt. "Your lover claims to be Zeus," the old woman said thoughtfully. "But how can you be certain? Any man might claim to be a god to seduce a princess. Have you ever actually seen proof of his divinity?" Semele, who had never questioned Zeus's identity, suddenly found herself uncertain. "You should ask him to prove it," she suggested. "Ask him to appear before you in his true form, as he appears to Hera on Olympus. If he truly loves you, He will show you his real self. The idea took root. When Zeus next visited, Semele asked him to grant her a wish, anything of her choosing. Zeus, keen to please his mortal lover, would agree, swearing by the river Styx, the most sacred and binding oath any god could make. "Show me your true form," Semele said. "Appear to me as you appear to Hera, in your full divine glory." Zeus's face fell. "Please," he begged, "ask for anything else. That gift will kill you. No mortal can look upon a god's true form and survive." But Semele insisted, and Zeus had sworn by the Styx he could not break that oath. Not for any reason. He transformed before her eyes. Lightning crackled around his body, and thunder shook the palace. His divine radiance blazed like the sun brought to earth, and Semele had time for one scream before the heat consumed her, burning her body to ash in an instant. Zeus stood in the ruins of the chamber, shaking his head as the smoke rose around him. But as he went to leave, he noticed something stirring in Semele's ashes. The child, not yet fully formed, but still alive, had been protected by the divine blood in its veins. Zeus cut his own thigh and placed the infant inside, sewing the wound closed with golden thread. For the next 3 months, he carried the unborn child in his own flesh, completing the pregnancy that Semele's death had interrupted. When the time came, he cut the stitches and delivered the baby himself, a son born alive and healthy from the side of his leg.
He named the child Dionysus, the twice-born god, and gave him to nymphs in distant lands to raise in secret, far from Hera's jealous gaze. Dionysus grew to adulthood and began traveling the world, spreading the gift of wine and gathering followers. His worship was unlike any other cult in Greece. His followers, mostly women called Maenads or Bacchae, would drink wine until a frenzy took them, abandoning their homes and families to dance wildly in the mountains in worship of the god. Dionysus offered liberation from the constraints of civilized life. In his rites, a slave and a queen were equal. Social inhibitions dissolved and the careful masks people wore in daily life fell away, replaced by something wild and primal. His followers called him the Liberator, for wine freed them from the rigid social roles of their ordinary lives. But not everyone welcomed Dionysus and his strange new cult. When he returned to his birthplace of Thebes, he found the city ruled by his cousin Pentheus, a young king who valued order and tradition above all else. When Pentheus heard reports of women abandoning their looms and children to drink wine and worship this new deity, he was appalled. But it was not until his own mother, Agave, decided to join the cult that disapproval turned to active hostility. And so when Dionysus arrived in Thebes claiming to be a god, Pentheus laughed at him. "You are no god," Pentheus declared. "You're a charlatan who uses wine to corrupt women and undermine proper society. I will not allow your cult in my city." Dionysus offered him multiple chances to recant, to honor him in the way a god should be honored. But Pentheus refused. He arrested Dionysus, threw him in prison, and ordered his soldiers to round up the Maenads by force. The prison, of course, could not hold Dionysus. He freed himself with but a thought, and appeared before Pentheus again, this time with a different offer. "You fear what the Maenads do in secret," Dionysus said, his voice persuasive. "Come with me to the mountain. See for yourself what happens in my rites. I will disguise you so they do not recognize you. You can watch safely and return to make an informed judgment." Pentheus, driven by curiosity and the need to gather evidence against the cult, agreed. Dionysus dressed him in women's clothing, for only women were permitted at the rites, and led him to Mount Cithaeron, where the Maenads were celebrating. But once they arrived, Dionysus called out to his followers, "Women of Thebes, see a man who mocks your worship. See the king who calls your god false. He has come as a spy." Looked up to their king and saw only an intruder threatening their sacred rites. Led by Agave, Pentheus's own mother, they converged on him. Pentheus tore off his disguise and cried out, "Mother, it is me, Pentheus, your son. Do not harm me." But Agave, her mind clouded by the divine madness, saw not her son, but a mountain lion threatening their ritual. "Sisters," she called, "a beast has infiltrated our sacred space. Tear it apart." They fell upon him. Pentheus screamed and begged, called his mother's name again and again, but the Maenads heard only the roar of a wild animal. They pulled him to the ground and began to tear him apart. When the frenzy faded and the wine's influence began to lift, Agave found herself holding something heavy. She looked down, expecting to see the head of the lion she had slain. Instead, she saw her son's face, his expression frozen in terror and disbelief. Her scream could be heard across the valley. The other Maenads, returning to their senses and realizing what they had done, began to weep. It was then that Dionysus appeared among them, no longer disguised. "This is what happens," he said, his voice cold, "when mortals reject the gods. Pentheus denied my divinity. He imprisoned me and tried to suppress my worship. This is the price of his arrogance." He left the women there with their grief and horror, his message clear. Dionysus was not merely the jolly god of wine and parties. He was dangerous. Those who rejected him learned that the God who freed people from constraints could also free them from sanity with unrestrained ecstasy, driving people to acts they would never commit in their right minds. Dionysus was not only a god of vengeance and madness, he could also be generous beyond measure to those who honored him and treated his followers well. There was a king in Phrygia named Midas who ruled a prosperous kingdom but always wanted more. He was obsessed with wealth and gold, desiring to accumulate riches that would make him the envy of other kings. One day, his servants found Silenus, a companion and tutor to Dionysus, asleep and drunk in the royal gardens, having wandered away from the god's retinue during a festival. Rather than driving the creature away, Midas treated him as an honored guest for 10 days before returning him safely to Dionysus. The god was pleased. "You have shown hospitality to one who is dear to me," he said, Ask any reward you wish and I will grant it. Midas did not hesitate. Give me the power to turn anything I touch into gold. Dionysus frowned, recognizing the danger in such a wish. But he had made his promise. As he wished, Midas returned to his palace in joy. He touched a pillar and watched it transform into solid gold. He ran his fingers along the walls, the furniture, his clothing, and everything became the precious metal. He summoned guests from across the kingdom to witness his miraculous gift, touching objects to demonstrate his power, watching his wealth multiply before everyone's eyes. After hours of displaying his abilities, Midas grew thirsty and called for wine. His servants brought a cup, but the moment the liquid touched his lips, it hardened into gold. He dropped the cup in alarm and reached for bread instead. But the bread too became gold in his hands. The meat, the fruit, everything he tried to eat or drink transformed the instant it touched him. He could not consume anything. Panic began to set in. Midas dismissed his guests and sat alone in his golden dining hall, surrounded by wealth he could not enjoy, starving in the midst of plenty. His daughter heard him crying and ran to comfort him. "Father, what is wrong?" she asked, reaching out to take his hand. The moment her fingers touched his, they stiffened. Gold crept up her arm like frost, spreading across glass. She tried to pull away, but could not move. The transformation continued, spreading across her body, turning flesh to metal, until all that remained was a golden statue of a little girl, her arm outstretched toward her father, forever reaching to comfort him. Midas collapsed beside the statue, sobbing. He had wanted wealth above all things, and now his greed had cost him the only thing that truly mattered. He left his palace and traveled to find Dionysus, falling to his knees before the god. "Please," Midas begged, "please take back your gift. I want my daughter back. I want to eat and drink like a normal man. I was a fool to ask for such a thing." Dionysus looked at him with pity. "Go to the source of the river Pactolus," he said. "Bathe in those waters, and your golden touch will be washed away." Midas traveled to the river's source and plunged himself into the cold water. Gold streamed from his body like paint washing away, the divine curse dissolving in the current. When he emerged, he was an ordinary man again, capable of touching without transforming, of eating and drinking like anyone else. But when he returned home, his daughter was as he had left her, a statue of gold, arms still outstretched, still reaching for the father who had turned her to metal with his greed. Midas had his life back, but he would spend the rest of it in a palace with a golden reminder of what his desire had cost him. The river Pactolus, they say, ran rich with gold from that day forward, the precious metals still washing down from its source, where Midas's curse had been cleansed. Demeter, one of the 12 Olympians and sister to Zeus, was the goddess of the harvest and the cycles of growth that sustained all mortal life. She taught humanity the secrets of agriculture, how to plant seeds, tend crops, and reap what they had sown. Before her gifts, humans had lived as scavengers and hunters, but Demeter transformed them into farmers, giving them the knowledge to work with the earth rather than simply take from it. Under her care, the world existed in eternal spring. Crops grew thick and golden without fail. Orchards bore fruit year-round. Humanity flourished, believing this eternal bounty would never end. But it was not to last, for there was one thing that Demeter loved above all else. One thing that she would gladly sacrifice humanity in order to protect: her daughter Persephone. Persephone, the daughter of Demeter and Zeus, had grown into a beautiful young woman. She knew nothing of darkness or sorrow, living in the eternal spring her mother had created for her. Demeter loved her more than anything in creation, and Persephone loved the world her mother had made. But Persephone had another admirer, one she knew nothing about. Hades, lord of the underworld and brother to Zeus, had seen her during one of his rare visits to the surface. He wanted her as his queen, and Zeus, without consulting Demeter or asking Persephone herself, agreed to the match. What happened next would change the world forever. One day, while Persephone was walking through a meadow in Sicily with her companions, a flower unlike any she had ever seen bloomed before her, a narcissus, impossibly beautiful, seeming to call to her. She reached down to pluck it, enchanted by its beauty. The moment she did, the earth split open beneath her feet. A great chasm tore through the meadow, and from that darkness Hades emerged in his black chariot. Before Persephone could scream, before her companions could reach her, he seized her and pulled her down into the earth. The ground closed above them, swallowing her completely, and she was gone, taken forever to the land of death. Demeter heard the cries of her companions and came running. When she learned that her daughter had disappeared, that no one knew where she had gone or what had taken her, terror seized her. She began searching immediately, wandering the earth for 9 days and 9 nights without rest, calling Persephone's name and receiving no answer. Finally, Helios, the sun god who sees all things, took pity on her and revealed the truth. Hades had taken Persephone to the underworld with Zeus's permission, and she now sat as queen of the dead in the realm far below. Demeter's grief turned to rage. Her daughter had been stolen, dragged to a place from which no living thing returned, and her own brother had arranged it without her knowledge or consent. She withdrew from Olympus and locked herself away, refusing to let anything grow until Persephone was returned to her without the goddess of harvest. The world began to die. Crops withered in the fields. Trees bore no fruit. Grass turned brown and crumbled to dust. The eternal spring that had blessed the earth ended, replaced by cold and hunger. Mortals starved as their stores of food ran empty, and nothing new would grow to replace them. The earth itself seemed to be mourning Persephone's loss, and humanity stood on the brink of extinction. Only then, with mortals dying by the thousands, did Zeus intervene. He could not allow all of humanity to perish, for without mortals to worship them, the gods would lose much of their power and purpose. He sent Hermes, the messenger god, down to the underworld with a command. Hades must return Persephone to her mother. Hades agreed. But before Persephone left, he offered her pomegranate seeds, 6 of them, as a parting gift. Still innocent, Persephone ate them, not understanding what it meant. The food of the underworld binds those who consume it to that realm forever. She had sealed her own fate. When Zeus learned what had happened, he was forced to broker a compromise. The pomegranate seeds could not be undone, but neither could the world survive without Demeter's blessings. So it was decreed that Persephone would spend 6 months of each year with Hades in the underworld as his queen, and 6 months with her mother in the world above. For half the year, when Persephone returns to the surface, Demeter's joy causes nature to bloom across the earth. Spring arrives, flowers blossom, and crops grow thick and golden, with the earth bathed in summer's warm light. But when Persephone descends to the underworld for her 6 months as queen of the dead, Demeter's grief causes the plants to wither and die. Trees lose their leaves, and the land freezes over with the earth suffering under winter's chill. And so the seasons began. Born from a mother's grief and a daughter's fate, an eternal cycle of death and rebirth that will continue as long as the world endures. Of all the gods of ancient Greece, few were feared more than Hades. Yet that fear was born from what he represented, rather than the god himself. For Hades was not cruel or petty like many of his fellow Olympians. He did not demand worship through terror or punish mortals for petty slights. He was stern, yes, and unyielding in his enforcement of death's laws. But he was also fair in ways that Zeus and Poseidon rarely bothered to be. When the 3 brothers had drawn lots to divide the cosmos after defeating the Titans, Hades had received the underworld, a realm none of the other gods wanted, a kingdom of shadows where no flowers grew and no joy existed. He accepted this burden without complaint, ruling the desolate realm for countless ages. He rarely left his domain, caring little for the petty squabbles of Olympus. He simply did his duty, sorting and keeping the dead, maintaining the natural order that allowed the world above to function. Mortals feared him because they feared death itself, and Hades was death's administrator. But he did not cause death, for that power belonged to Thanatos, the personification of death, who claimed the souls of mortals when their time came. It was for Hades to rule over these souls in the underworld, his vast domain beneath the surface of the world. The boundary between the living world and the realm of the dead was marked by the river Styx, a vast black waterway that circled the underworld 9 times. No living person could cross it and return unchanged. Even the gods swore their most sacred oaths upon the Styx, for to break such an oath brought terrible punishment. Waiting at the river shore was Charon, the ancient ferryman who had tended these waters since the world began. He was a skeletal figure draped in rotting cloth with hollow eyes that had witnessed countless souls pass into his boat. His task was eternal and simple: ferry the dead across the Styx to the realm beyond. But passage came at a price. When Greeks buried their dead, they placed a coin, an obol, under the deceased's tongue to pay Charon's fee. Those who died without proper burial, whose bodies were left to rot on battlefields, or whose families were too poor to provide the coin, were condemned to wander the shores of the Styx for 100 years before the ferryman would take pity and grant them passage. Beyond the river stood the gates of the underworld itself, massive structures of adamantine that had never been breached, and guarding those gates was Cerberus, the three-headed hound of Hades. Cerberus was enormous, each of his 3 heads capable of tearing a man apart, his body covered in dark fur through which serpents writhed. His purpose was twofold: prevent the living from entering the realm of the dead, and more importantly, prevent the dead from escaping back to the world above. Once past Cerberus, the souls arrived at a great plaza where 3 thrones sat upon a raised platform. Here resided the judges of the dead, Minos Rhadamanthus and Aeacus. All 3 had been kings in life, renowned for their wisdom and justice, and in death the gods had appointed them to weigh every soul that entered the underworld. The judges examined each spirit, perceiving the entire arc of their mortal existence in moments. They saw every deed, every kindness, every cruelty. They knew what each person had done and what they had failed to do, and based on this judgment, they directed each soul to one of 3 destinations. Most souls, the vast majority, were sent to the Asphodel Meadows. This was not punishment or reward, simply existence. The meadows stretched endlessly under a grey, sourceless light, and there the spirits of ordinary people wandered without purpose or memory. These were those who had lived unremarkable lives, neither exceptionally virtuous nor exceptionally wicked. They had simply been, and now they simply were, fading slowly over centuries until nothing remained but the faintest echo of who they had once been. After 1,000 years in the meadows, souls were given a choice. They could drink from the river Lethe, the river of forgetfulness, which would wash away all memory of their previous life. Born anew with no recollection of what they had been, they could return to the mortal world and live again. The cycle would continue, death and rebirth forever. A rare few were sent to Elysium, the paradise of eternal bliss. These were heroes, demigods, and mortals who had been especially favored by the gods or who had performed deeds of extraordinary virtue. In Elysium, every pleasure of life could be enjoyed without end. There were feasts and hunts every day, and music and celebration every night. Most souls who reached Elysium chose to remain there forever, rather than risk rebirth into a harsher world. And within Elysium, across a golden shore, lay the Isle of the Blessed, reserved for the greatest heroes of all, those like Achilles and Odysseus, whose fame would never fade. But some souls were sent to Tartarus, the deepest pit of the underworld, and their fate was far worse than fading into grey obscurity. Tartarus was reserved for the worst of criminals, those who had committed crimes so terrible that even death could not end their suffering. Kinslayers, oath-breakers, those who had defied the gods, all found themselves cast into the burning depths, where the river Phlegethon flowed with actual fire, illuminating the pit with a red glow. This was where the Titans had been imprisoned after their defeat, sealed behind bronze walls and adamantine gates. And this was where mortal souls who violated the most sacred laws joined them in eternal torment. Hades himself designed the punishments, each one tailored to fit the crime. Sisyphus, the king of Corinth, had been the cleverest mortal who ever lived. He had cheated death twice, first by tricking Thanatos into binding himself in chains, then by convincing Persephone to let him return to the surface and refusing to return. He had laughed at the gods, boasting of his cleverness, believing himself above the natural order. For this arrogance, he was condemned to push an enormous boulder up a steep hill. Every time he reached the summit, the boulder would slip from his grasp and roll back down. He had to start again and again and again, forever trying to achieve what could never be achieved, knowing success was impossible, but unable to stop. Tantalus, a king who had been a son of Zeus, committed a crime even worse. He murdered his own son, Pelops, cooked the boy's flesh, and served it to the gods at a feast to test their powers of perception, wanting to know if they could truly see all things. For this unspeakable act, he stood for eternity in a pool of water up to his waist and fruit-laden branches above his head. But when he bent to drink, the water receded, and when he reached for the fruit, the branches lifted just beyond his grasp. He was eternally hungry, eternally thirsty, with relief perpetually denied. From his suffering came the word tantalize, to be tormented by something just out of reach. The Danaids, 50 sisters who had murdered their husbands on their wedding night, were forced to fill a massive vessel with water. But the vessel had countless holes in its sides and bottom. No matter how much water they poured, it drained away immediately. They would spend eternity attempting to fill what could never be filled, trying to wash away blood that would never come clean. And then there was Ixion, who had murdered his own king, and then lusted after Hera at Zeus's own table. For this, he was bound to a wheel of fire that spun endlessly through the air. The flames consumed his flesh, but could not kill him. His screams echoed through Tartarus, unceasing as the wheel turned on and on through eternity. The Furies, ancient goddesses born from the blood of Uranus, and older even than the Olympians, oversaw the torments with their whips and serpent hair, ensuring that the damned could never escape their fate. They were merciless, hunting down those who broke the most sacred of laws, ensuring they would suffer for eternity. But while the underworld was filled with judgment and punishment, Hades and Persephone were not cruel rulers. They understood grief and loss better than most, and occasionally they could be moved to mercy. The greatest example of this came when Orpheus, the most gifted musician in all of Greece, arrived at the shores of the Styx. Orpheus had married Eurydice on a spring morning when the world seemed full of promise. She was a nymph, beautiful and gentle, who had fallen in love with his music before she ever saw his face. Their wedding should have been the beginning of a long and happy life together. Instead, it lasted less than a day. That afternoon, as Eurydice walked through a meadow celebrating her new marriage, she stepped near a snake hidden in the tall grass. It struck her ankle before she saw it. The venom worked quickly, and by the time her companions carried her back to Orpheus, her skin was already cold. She died in his arms as the sun was setting on their wedding day, her last words a whisper of his name. Orpheus's grief shattered the world around him when he played his lyre. The music was so sorrowful that trees wept sap and rivers slowed in their courses. Unable to accept the loss, he made a decision that bordered on madness. He would go to the underworld and bring her back. When he reached the river Styx, Charon refused him passage, for the living were not meant to cross. But Orpheus played music unlike anything that had ever been heard in that dark place. He played of love and loss, of sunlight and warmth, of all the beautiful things that existed in the world above. The ancient ferryman, moved by what he heard, agreed to take him across. At the gates, Cerberus growled and prepared to attack, but Orpheus played a gentle lullaby, music that spoke of peace and rest. The three-headed guardian sat down, the red glow fading from his eyes, resting all three heads on his massive paws. For the first time in his eternal existence, the god of the dead began to dream with Orpheus slipping past into the underworld proper. He passed through the grey asphodel meadows, past the judgment seat where the three kings sorted souls, descending deeper until he reached the palace of Hades itself. There, standing before the thrones of the Lord and Lady of the dead, he begged them to release his wife's spirit. Hades refused immediately. The dead did not return to life. This was the fundamental law of existence, and he did not make exceptions. But Persephone, who knew what it was to be taken from the world she loved, asked to hear his music. Orpheus played for them, and this time his music told the story of his love for Eurydice. He sang of their brief happiness and her death, of the wound her absence had carved in him that would never heal. He sang of loving someone so completely that their loss made the world itself seem meaningless. When the last note faded, Persephone wept. Even Hades looked changed, his stern expression softened by what he had heard. No one had ever made the Queen of the Dead cry. No one had ever reminded the Lord of Death what it meant to feel. "What you ask violates the fundamental law of existence," Hades said finally. "But your music has moved even us. I will make you an offer One chance and one chance only. The terms were simple and cruel. Eurydice would follow Orpheus back to the surface, walking behind him as they returned through the underworld, but he could not look at her, not once. Not until they both stood in the sunlight of the living world. If he turned, if he looked back even for a moment before they were both fully in the light, she would return to Hades forever. Orpheus accepted. He had no choice. The journey back was torment. He walked in silence, hearing nothing behind him, unable to confirm that Eurydice truly followed. Doubt gnawed at him with every step. What if she had stumbled? What if she was not there at all? But he pressed forward, trusting in faith alone, because faith was all he had. He crossed the Styx again, past the sleeping Cerberus, and began the long climb back to the surface. Soon the darkness began to lessen. He could see the cave entrance ahead, sunlight filtering in, warm and golden. He was almost there, just a few more steps. He stepped out of the cave into the light of the living world. Joy overwhelming him. He had done it. Against every law of death he had succeeded. Eurydice was free. He turned around, a smile on his face, ready to embrace his wife. He saw her standing just behind him, more beautiful than he remembered. Relief flooded through him. She was there. Hades had kept his word. But Eurydice was not smiling. Her expression was one of horror. Orpheus stood in sunlight, warm light bathing his back. But Eurydice remained in shadow, still standing within the cave. One more step. She had needed just one more step. "No," she whispered. "Orpheus, what have you done?" He had turned too soon. They must both stand in the world of the living. Both be fully in the light. In his overwhelming joy, he had simply forgotten. "Eurydice," he called out, reaching for her desperately. But she was already fading, pulled back down to the darkness below. The condition had been violated. She belonged to Hades again, and there would be no second chance. "I love you," she said, her voice growing fainter. "I was there the whole time. You just had to wait a little longer." "Eurydice," he cried, lunging forward, but his hands passed through mist. She was gone, returned to the grey meadows from which she had briefly escaped. Orpheus stood alone in the sunlight, his hands still reaching for something that was no longer there. He had been so close, and he had lost everything in a single moment of joy. Thank you for listening to this presentation of Soft History Stories. We hope you enjoyed this journey through the epic tales of the Greek gods. These stories have survived for thousands of years, reminding us of the power of love, the danger of pride, and the timeless truths that connect us all. Until next time, stay curious and keep exploring the stories that shaped our world.